Hey, life group leaders, welcome to the Monday morning coaching. First, let me just say thank you for all of you who were able to come out and contribute last night to our life group leader roundtable. It was amazing. You guys were awesome. I loved spending time with you. We got to eat some good pork, so thanks to Mandy for that one. But it was so great just being a part of the conversation, hearing what God is doing in some of your groups, and just being able to share some ideas. It was so helpful for me as a leader to try to learn how I can better serve you. And there were so many great ideas that I think all of us can learn and implement in our group. So again, just thank you for being a part of that, and look forward to doing that again. Let's dive in to this week's material. We're talking about obedience this week. And so as you're beginning your conversation, any discussion that helps you to dive into the idea of obedience and disobedience will be great. All of us can tell a story about a 2-year-old that we had that just wanted to always push the line and wait till we weren't looking and then step over. That's the idea. Anything that you can get into as it relates to our obedience and every one of us having the desire to disobey, that would be really helpful. So whatever funny story you got, you heard a few of mine yesterday, share some of those with your group, get everybody involved in that discussion in that way. And then we're going to drop into the observation section where we're jumping into 1 John chapter 2, where he lays out this expectation that we will not sin, and which is a huge kind of mind-blowing idea for many people, that might be the expectation, because we've all kind of bought into this idea that I'm always going to have sin and I'm always going to sin, and so I might as well enjoy it while I can. Many of us have bought into that, and saying that would be helpful for your group. Own that part of who you are. But he says our expectation is that we will not sin. So the question is that possible? Well, the scripture seems to point in that direction. 2 Peter 1:3, I shared that yesterday, that God has given us everything that we need for life and godliness. Godliness being like God. Let me share with you one more. Titus chapter 2, starting in verse 11. It says, the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. And we all love that. Jesus came and he died. We celebrate that. Salvation, grace has appeared to all men, and we get it. We love that. But he follows that up by saying this, and it teaches us to say no to ungodliness, worldly passions, and to live a self-controlled, upright, and godly life in this present age. So there's the grace of God that saves us is the same grace, he says, that is given to us to teach us to say no to ungodliness, worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives, not somewhere in the by and by, not one day over the rainbow, not when we're, worm food, in this present age, that he has given us the ability to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. So if the grace of God that's in us to save us, then that same grace is there to teach us to say no to ungodliness. And what I always say is, kind of as a point to people, is if we're not learning and growing how to say, in our ability to say no to ungodliness, and that's when I question our ability to be saved, because he says that grace is one and the same. It's doing the same thing, work in us. So maybe that'd be a text you might want to use with your group that I didn't get to talk about. Here's another one. Talk about how Jesus is speaking in our defense, and I mentioned this week that the reason he gets to do that, or the why he's so effective in doing that, is because he's been where we've been. Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 14 through 16, talks about Jesus as our high priest, and because he's been where we are, he is able to sympathize with our weakness. Not only that, but it says we now can go to him and pray to him and find help in our time of weakness, because he's been where we've been, and so he understands what we're going through. So he speaks on our behalf, but he can also speak to us and help us in our weakness because he's been here. Keep going. I asked this question, on the third question down, what connection, if any, does our culture place between knowing God and obeying God? And I think the obvious answer is not much. That we live in a world where everybody claims to know God, and they have little or no care if they obey God. And so the connection between our culture, knowing God and obeying God, is very, very flimsy. Yet, Jesus makes very high connections between our knowing God and our obeying God. And you can read those couple of passages there. So I think that's a tension that you might want to wrestle with in your group. Why is it that Jesus makes these really hard connections and we don't make these hard connections? I asked the question, why do you think so many people who call themselves Christians want to distance themselves from their standing with God connected to their obedience to God? So most people in our culture, we don't want to put our obedience to God and our connection to God very close together. We want to keep those apart, that I'm saved no matter what I do. People push back because they claim they're saved by faith, but Jesus doesn't seem nearly as concerned about that. In fact, let me just share a couple of observations. Every judgment scene in the Bible, when it talks about how we're going to stand before God someday, I shared one this week, every one of them always point to what we do, not what we believe. It always points to what we do, not what we say. Every one. Let me give you two you can share with your group. Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 through 13, and Revelation 22, verse 12. Now, I do want to point out again that it's not our obedience that is the catalyst for our relationship with God, but it is our obedience that is the evidence of our relationship with God. We cannot truly know God and not be obedient to Him. So Jesus never asked in any judgment scene, what did you believe? What did you say? What did you claim? He always asked, what did you do? I can look at your deeds and see what you believe. Your deeds show me what you believe. In fact, James, the brother of Jesus, talked about that, how faith without works is dead. And you can look at that, James chapter 2, starting in verse 14, going through verse 26. So all throughout Scripture, there's this very tight connection between our behavior, what we do, the way that we live, our obedience to Christ, and our relationship with Christ. So all of that coming back, I don't want us to get into the place where we're wagging our finger saying you need to obey, because it doesn't work. You tried it with your children, it doesn't work. Instead, how about we get to the place where we say, let's get to know Him, and out of our knowing Him and our relationship with Him, obedience is a natural byproduct of that. And so that's why we come down to the application points. He is holy, He is almighty, and He is good. Lean into those as a big part of your discussion this week. If you know this, if you truly know this, what effect does this have on your obedience to God? And then challenge your people. Let's meditate on one of them. What is the one that you have the hardest time believing? Not cognitively, but actually living like you believe it. What is the one you have the hardest time? Invite them to write it on a card, write them on a window, write it on a mirror, put it somewhere where they'll see it, and live out of that this week and talk about what effect that had on their obedience when you come back and meet together with them next week. Love you guys. Have a great week. We will see you soon.